Hello there and good afternoon to this special coverage of Ukraine-Russia conflict. Vladimir Putin's war, the so-called special military operation against Ukraine, has unleashed a revival of Cold War liberalism in American and European political discourse and punditry. NATO is back. The West is assembling against the backdrop. It was only a matter of time before the call went out for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said Moscow's parade commemorating the defeat of the Nazis and end of the World War II might be used to drum up support for a mass mobilization of troops and renewed push into Ukraine. Based on these recent events, the question should be raised, is Russia now really want to relaunch its military operation all over Ukraine? And why the Nazis' description is being attached to Ukraine as Russia claimed, and vice versa, to Russia as UK and Ukraine are claiming. To answer these questions, we have Mr. Dennis Small, an Air Magazine's American editor in the weekly strategic analysis magazine founded by Lyndon LaRouche, and Hisham Nowar, writer and international relations researcher from Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before delving in our debate, the Russian President Vladimir Putin marked Victory Day, celebrating the Soviet Union's World War II triumph over Nazi Germany. The Russian leader linked this war in Ukraine with the historic struggle in a speech that blamed the West for the conflict. More in this report.
On Moscow's Red Square, Russian President Vladimir Putin led the annual Victory Day parade on May 9th, which marks the anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The Russian president relates his war in Ukraine with that historic struggle. In a speech, Putin proclaims that his army is fighting in Ukraine to defend the homeland against the external threat that, according to him, intends to weaken and split Russia.
These days, you are fighting for our people in Donbass, for the security of our homeland, Russia. You are fighting for the homeland, for its future, so that no one forgets the lessons of World War II, so that there is no place in the world for executioners, punishers, and Nazis.
Putin promised that Russia would look after the dead soldiers' children and families.
Every death of our soldiers and officers is a grief to us all, and irreplaceable loss to their families and friends. The state, the regions, businesses and public organizations will do all they can to look after their families and help them.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, commemorating the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, said his country would win in its war with Russia and would not abandon any territory.
We are fighting for the freedom of our children, and therefore we will win. We will never forget what our ancestors did in World War II, where more than 8 million Ukrainians died. The war took at least 50 million lives.
Russia has started what it calls special military operation in Ukraine on February 24th. Russian president justifies Russia's invasion, that NATO was creating threats right next to its borders.
And based on this report, I'll be starting with you, Mr. Dennis. How can you read Putin's speech? He said, this year's parade represents another victory for our nation and for our ancestors. In other words, USSR. Is he looking to bring back the Soviet Union, or this is just a celebration words?
No, I don't think the intention is to bring back the Soviet Union. I think the intention is to prevent what nearly happened to the Soviet Union in World War II. They lost 27 million people in the fight against fascism, along with the Allies in the United States and the UK and others, played a central role in defeating fascism at that time. And I think that they view what is happening in Ukraine today through the prism of that historical experience. And I think they are right to do that. There is much discussion in the media about how this is an unprovoked attack by Putin on Ukraine, and that is simply not true. If you look back 30 years, which the Russians have mentioned repeatedly, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia was given repeated assurances by the West, including by the Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker III, that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, and it guaranteed that there would be no placement of heavy weapons there. NATO did not move 1 inch to the east. It moved 1,000 kilometers to the east. 16 countries later, right at the border of Russia, and repeatedly over this entire 30-year period, especially in the last 2 years, Russia stated that they would feel a systemic danger to their nation if this continued. Russia's warnings were ignored, and the results are what we are seeing in Ukraine. The alternative is clearly at hand, which is a neutral Ukraine, a guarantee of no NATO expansion, and a negotiated peace along the lines of what we in Western Europe and the United States recall as the Treaty of Westphalia from the 17th century, when the security interests of all sides were protected, not just one side. So what happened in Ukraine was indeed provoked. What concerns me more than that history is the fact that the provocations are continuing. The stated intent from the United States, including the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, is to weaken and degrade Russia. And this will simply provoke a situation where Russia is backed into a corner and the danger of nuclear war is moving ahead very rapidly towards 1 minute before midnight.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Hisham, Russia's picture now has changed in the whole world and precisely in Europe. So, as an international relation expert, how can you consider this military operation so far? And do you agree with what Mr. Dennis has said? Chronologically speaking, Russia has been saying just for NATO to stay away from its border, but the vice versa, it happened the opposite.
Yes, I agree with Mr. Dennis. Since 2008, since Russia invaded Georgia first, and then Crimea, many things happened in the world. Russia came back to the international stage, tried to prove themselves as one of the superpowers in the world, and the NATO refused to consider that or to put that in consideration. That's why Russia now feels that she pledged themselves to put themselves back to this international stage, to push back NATO extensions from their borders, from their backyard in Ukraine and Georgia, and they now seems to be achieving their goals and let's say drying NATO resources, drying EU resources by supplying Ukraine with all kinds of weapons, by supplying Ukraine with their needs during this war. I think Russia now is trying to prove to the whole world that NATO and the European countries didn't put in consideration that they have let's say a security needs, and they need a security guarantee that this extension towards their borders will not affect them. So what Putin is trying to say and do in Ukraine is just to fight with Western camp within or during Ukraine to try to prove his point of view and to try to sit with NATO leaders on the same table and negotiate the future of this, let's say, organization, which was devoted against the Soviet Union and now against Russia. So we can understand why Russia is trying to involve or to be more involved in Ukraine. We understand that they have the Russians they need security needs towards, let's say, the NATO and European countries. But on the other hand, the other side refused to put that in consideration, refused to deal with the Ukrainian crisis as a strategical and political level, not a military level. They still supplying Ukraine with all kinds of weapons, which makes this war strength.
Perfect. We'll come to this point. All right, moving on now. In an important speech from the National Army Museum, British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace sent a strong message to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday on the occasion of the Russian Victory Day. Ben Wallace said that the master of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, reflects the fascism of the Nazi Germany during the World War II. He added that there can be no victory day for Moscow, but a day of defeat in Ukraine and the shame for the Russian president.
Through the invasion of Ukraine, Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago, repeating the errors of the last century's totalitarian regimes. They are showing the same disregard for human lives, national sovereignty and the rules-based international system. The very system, not least the United Nations Charter itself, that we conceived together and for which we fought and were victorious together, in the hope of saving future generations from the scourge of war.
Mr. Dennis, coming back to you, Vladimir Putin tells Victory Day parade military action was necessary due to the West preparing for an invasion of the Russian lands. And now UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace is saying that Russia should share the same fate as the Nazis, who ended up facing the Nuremberg trial for their atrocities. Based on this point, which side is being Nazis, Russia or Ukraine?
Country is being Nazi, but I think there are very powerful forces inside Ukraine which are in fact Nazis and neo-Nazis, and they are, curiously enough, defended and supported and armed and equipped by both the United Kingdom and the United States. I'm referring to those who historically are linked to Stepan Bandera, who was the Ukrainian leader during World War II, who was an explicit open ally of Adolf Hitler. I'm referring to the right sector. I'm referring to the Azov battalion, now known as the Azov regiment. I'm referring to people like Dmitry Yarosh, who is one of the leaders of those groups, who is currently an advisor to the defense minister of Ukraine. These are forces that were put into power in Ukraine with the 2014 Maidan color revolution, which was organized and paid for by the United States State Department, according to the public statements by Victoria Nuland, who has stated this over and over again, that $5 billion were spent by the United States and supposed NGOs to finance the color revolution. That brought in a government which included a very powerful element of neo-Nazis. The irony is that President Zelensky was elected with the idea of changing the course in Ukraine towards a peaceful negotiation with Russia. But Zelensky himself has been subjected to massive pressure and threats, direct death threats, from the right sector, from the Banderista crowd, from Yarosh and company, that he absolutely must not negotiate and must not come to an agreement. Now, the driving force behind this is the United Kingdom and their allies in the United States. It has been Wallace. It has been Liz Truss. It has been Austin. It has been Blinken, who have stated repeatedly the kind of things which you just heard, which from the standpoint of Russia can be read as nothing but a threat to eliminate them as a power on the planet. To do that with a nuclear superpower is psychotic. It is extraordinarily dangerous. I cannot overstate how dangerous that is. And fortunately, voices are being raised in the West, in the United States and elsewhere, against the danger of nuclear war, saying we have to sit down and negotiate, stop talking about eliminating Russia. Because the problem did not begin on February 24th of this year. It began 30 years ago with the extension of NATO eastward, then followed by the 2014 coup d'etat, a right-wing neo-Nazi coup d'etat in Ukraine. And then when President Putin presented proposed treaties to NATO and the United States to bring about a solution of everybody's security concerns, those proposals were simply ignored. The danger here is not what has happened until today. The danger here is that what provoked this crisis, this arrogance of the West, driven by the financial crisis, is continuing. And it is trying to back Russia into a corner, and the same with China. And this will lead to a nuclear confrontation unless that policy is stopped. So the danger is increasing, not because of Russia, but because of the forces in the West who think that the only way to save their crashing, bankrupt system is by eliminating Russia and eliminating China. That policy must be changed.
Perfectly understood. Based on these points and derived from the words of Mr. Dennis, Mr. Hisham, do you think that the escalation that has been pushed forward each month and each day after the military operation already has been launched by the West, UK, US, do you think that it will lead to a nuclear war, as Mr. Dennis has stated?
I think so far we are going slowly to this confrontation because both sides are still standing on their grounds. They're still standing on their opinions. They are not going to negotiate soon. But unfortunately, there are another regional, let's say, superpower. They are trying to solve this issue. They are trying to solve the Russian-Ukrainian conflict by putting both sides on the same table, which is Turkey. Turkey has tried a lot of efforts last few weeks to bring both sides to Istanbul, to Antalya, then to Ankara, just to try to put an end for this conflict. But so far, their efforts didn't face any success, unfortunately. So if we need to put an end for this conflict, which affects all over the world, and threaten to have a global famine all over the world, and threaten to have, let's say, a war confrontation. So we need to look after and look about the sides which are considering the negotiation as the only solution for this conflict. So, but otherwise, if we are not going to negotiate, if we are not going to think peacefully about this conflict, it will extend outside Ukraine. It will affect whole of Europe, whole of Eastern of Europe and Baltic countries, and this will affect all over the world. So far, the Western camp, let's say, represented by NATO and EU, they think that Russia now is coming back to the international stage, and with China, of course, and they think that they must stop them before the world turns to be multiple superpowers, multiple superpower countries, which can divide or which can say share the resources, international resources. So, if the Western camp, considering that, it consider to admit that Russia and China are now a international superpower, this war will going to be end soon. But if they will still think that this will affect their power in the world, this will not be ending soon.
Perfectly understood. Moving on. Now, in a video interview with the G7 leaders, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that Russian missile strikes and deportation are a limitation of Nazi action during the World War II.
The missile strikes on Odessa and our other cities are an imitation of how the Nazis tried to bombard and destroy European cities. The deportation of more than 500,000 Ukrainians to Russia and the camps of filtration as they call them, set up by Russian troops in the occupied territories of Ukraine are imitations of the deportations and concentration camps organized by the Nazis in Europe.
Mr. Dennis, away of being Nazis or not, don't you think that Ukraine so far is being used as a weapon to harm Russia, as a proxy to fight the Moscow's war on behalf of the Western nation, in other words, NATO? And in your opinion, what is Turkey's role in this conflict?
Well, let me just start with that. I agree with my colleague Hisham that the role of Turkey is important and commendable in attempting to come to some sort of a negotiated solution. There are other countries that have tried to do the same thing, and this is all valuable and worth doing. However, to the point where the UK and the United States and NATO and so on continue to drive the force towards war and not negotiation, then these efforts are going to be fruitless, unfortunately. The decisions are not being made in Kiev. The decisions are being made in London and in Washington. And the statements coming out of Zelensky's mouth are written for him by public relations firms in the city of London. I mean, Zelensky is an actor. Let's not forget that. Many of these incidents that he refers to are cases of fake news, well documented, the whole Bucha question, the Mariupol theater, and so on. There's a long history of this kind of fake news activities, as has been repeatedly shown in the case of the white helmets in Syria, making up stories of weapons of mass destruction and so on. But what I would like to emphasize is that what is driving this towards war, and this is the question that we must ask and answer, is the bankruptcy of the entire transatlantic financial system. You are talking about $2 quadrillion of speculative financial assets. That's a 2 followed by 15 zeros. It is a speculative bubble which cannot possibly be paid off. But since the financial interests of Wall Street and the City of London are insistent on maintaining that financial bubble, this requires eliminating an alternative to that system, which the Chinese and the Russians are representing in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, and so on. Unless that collapse of the Western financial system is reversed and changed, the driving policy is going to be towards war. The founder of my magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, 30 years ago forecast that if these same neoliberal economic austerity policies were not changed, it would drive us in the direction of war. And that is what we are now seeing. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, there are ways to solve this thing. And Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is Mr. LaRouche's widow and the head of the Schiller Institute, has proposed a conference for international architecture of security and development. Very important, development as well as security. So that through a bankruptcy reorganization of this financial bubble, mm-hmm. a system can be created of actual economic development for the benefit both of the nations of the East around China and India and Russia, as well as the United States mm-hmm. and Europe, but not in the interests of Wall Street and the City of London. And that, I think, is the heart of the problem, both in terms of the war danger, and it points us in the right direction for an actual solution.
Perfectly understood. During a press conference with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he witnessed the brutality, or rather the brutality of what he called Russia's illegal war when he visited Irpin, a Kiev suburb.
We began our day today with a visit to Irpin, where I witnessed firsthand the brutality of Russia's illegal war, of neighborhoods battered, homes destroyed. Today, we send a resounding message to the world that Canada and our allies continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine.
Mr. Hisham, what does this visit mean? Is it symbolic, or it carries out another connotation?
I think all Western leaders visiting to Kiev is just trying to show how supportive they are to the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian government. They are trying to fix both sides on their sides, not trying to help to find a solution for this crisis. Let me also referring to something, trying to understand what's going on is a thing, and accepting that is another thing. I understand the Russian need for their security and national security. I understand they did that for reasonable issues or reasonable issue from their side, but we cannot, let's say, tolerate or accept that they are violating another country's sovereignty. So we should differentiate between this violation of Ukrainian land and sovereignty and accepting that. I understand that Russia has a need to prove themselves as one of the international superpowers come back to the international stage, but so far they are violating Ukrainian sovereignty. But in the other hand, the other camp or the other side, which is Western camp, EU, NATO, US, UK, they are not helping, not even the Ukrainian country or the international community to find a solution for this crisis. Or this crisis will affect all over the world. This crisis now threatens to have a global famine in all over the world, and threaten also the international food supply chains, which are now collapsing. So we need to find a solution for that. We need to negotiate to have an acceptable solution for both sides, and taking into consideration the both sides' needs.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Dennis, 2 minutes left, so briefly. The Canadian lawmakers last week voted anonymously on the call of Russia's attack in Ukraine as a genocide. And now Canadian Prime Minister visiting Kiev, as British Prime Minister has done it last month. So based on this event, do you think that Canada will cut its diplomatic relations with Russia definitely?
It could be. The West is shooting itself in the head, not in the foot, but in the head with the sanctions policy. I do have to express my amazement at the level of hypocrisy issuing from the mouths of people like Prime Minister Trudeau and from President Biden and so on. All of a sudden, this great concern for sovereignty of countries. What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? What about Syria? What about the endless colonial wars, which is what they have been, completely violating sovereignty, killing off hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, in defense of the Wall Street City of London system? That has to be stated. The question of the sanctions, however, again, points to the problem and to the solution, because the sanctions which have been implemented are so extreme that they are in fact going to destroy and help destroy the economies of Western Europe and the United States, which are dependent on the energy of Russia. We are now threatening to completely decouple from China, which will destroy the economies of the West. And in fact, the policy, again, of the City of London and Wall Street is to reduce the physical economy of the West as well as third world sectors in defense of this speculative bubble. Their stated policy on occasion has been to reduce the population, to depopulate, to reduce the population of the world. And I think that these are, in fact, all of the issues that are on the table. We would all do well to view the full strategic context of what's going on in Ukraine and not try to understand it in terms of 3 weeks or 3 months developments, but look at this global strategic picture of a collapsing transatlantic financial system versus an emerging new economic power, which is a benefit for the entire world around the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you ever so much, Mr. Dennis from USA, Mr. Hisham from Turkey. Thank you again for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held also tomorrow. For now, have a blessed evening.